Hello and welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable. I am your host, Sam Whitfield, broadcasting live from the American Watchman studios, along with my co-hosts. We only have two this week, so gentlemen, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Adam. I'm one of the editors and co-founders of American Watchmen.
I'm Joshua Johnson. I am also an editor and co-founder at American Watchmen. We need to come up with better introductions because we say the same thing almost every week at this point.
And we also need to we also need to decide like beforehand who goes first. So, there's not like that 2 second awkward pause. But anyway, gentlemen, it's great to see you. Uh this week it's Adam's turn to host the show. So, Adam, what are we discussing this week?
Well, it's a great question, Sam. One of the biggest events going on lately is not really events, but one of the biggest subjects going around now is censorship by big tech companies, mainly Google, Facebook, and Twitter. There's been several instances of censorship of conservative values, conservative channels, and conservative personalities on those different social media venues.
Yes, and I mean, I've on my own podcast, I've talked a lot about the Alex Jones case myself. He was one of the big ones, but obviously there are a lot more instances regarding social media censorship. So anyway, Adam, I know you had a couple of topics that you wanted to discuss on this since you're taking point. So feel free to start us off.
All right. Well, this first question is kind of a general question. It can go for either you or Sam and Josh, or both of you. So, what are your initial thoughts on this censoring?
Specifically of Alex Jones or in general?
Just in general.
I'll let Sam take that one. I'm going to think for a minute here.
Well, I mean, I'll just say, as one of the proprietors of American Watchmen, and as someone who has also been doing podcasting personally for 10 years now, I've worked pretty long and hard at building up my podcast and also building American Watchmen. And now I'm finally starting to make some money on my own podcast. Not to, not to boast, but this really disturbs me because with all of the censorship, of conservative news websites or even websites perceived as being potentially conservative, this is an exciting time to be around in media where anyone can become a citizen journalist or commentator. And yet the powers that be are, meaning Facebook and Twitter and all these different social media websites, they're now deciding who's too radical and who needs to be shut down. And it's a very small minority of very powerful people. And it concerns me greatly that they're shutting down the independent journalists now on both the left and on both the right and occasionally on the left too, which we'll get to maybe in a bit. I just don't like the idea of these platforms who claim to be open for everyone to use, then turning around and censoring perfectly harmless opinions, but simultaneously allowing radical leftists to spout their hatred as well. So there's a double standard. So
sure.
That's my take on it.
Did you say that the opinions were radically homeless? I'm sure you meant harmless. It just sounded like you said the opinions were homeless.
No. I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't enunciate. I said that these social media platforms seem to be censoring, at least in my opinion, pretty reasonable and otherwise harmless opinions. Like an example would be there are only two genders. Okay, um, you know that's that's not really like a harmful opinion. That may be controversial in 2018, but it's certainly not wishing anyone like bodily harm or anything like that. Okay, that's controversial and that can get you banned from these platforms now. Meanwhile, Sarah Jung or whatever her name at the New York Times is saying stuff like, uh, you know, and pardon my French, but I'm just quoting here. Fuck white people and white people need to die. Uh, you know, that's okay because she's in the same, it's her right to expression. Uh, you know, it just, there's a double standard. That's just
Uh,
really irritating me.
I think it's interesting that you bring up the New York Times reporter because the argument that they're sort of offering up to justify Facebook and Twitter and Google and all these other ones censoring conservatives or progressives on the left or anti-establishment leftists. I don't know. I'm not sure if I would use progressive as the term for them, but censoring these groups. The argument they've used is that, well, Facebook and Twitter are media companies just like the New York Times or anyone else, because nobody would really dispute that the New York Times or even we at American Watchmen have a right to determine what kind of content or what kind of view we're willing to put out there. Obviously, the New York Times editorial board is apparently fine with her apparent racism, but other outlets wouldn't be, and in my opinion, shouldn't be, and can choose not to publish her if they so if that's their take on it. They don't have to publish her stuff. With Facebook, though, even though they claim to be a media,
Sorry, someone's at the door.
anyways, even if they don't claim to be even if they claim to be a media company, they're not really a media company like the New York Times, because they're not really a news organization. People might get news from them, but they're not getting that news from Facebook. That news is being posted on the platform by users, and a lot of the time it isn't even really news. It's just people's opinions, and they're voicing their case. So it's more like a virtual town hall, if you will. Which is why people are more disturbed by Facebook or Twitter banning somebody than they are by the New York Times, say, choosing to not hire a conservative and choosing to allow a blatant racist such as her to write in their pages.
Right.
And I think the core of it really is that Facebook and these other social media platforms aren't media in the sense that the New York Times or American Watchman or any other publication or news channel is. They're more of an online virtual public square, which has some pretty different. It's got a whole different set of implications to it, because how can anyone own the public square, or how can you regulate that without violating First Amendment rights? Right now, it's a private company, so under the law, Facebook has the complete right to ban anybody they want. The problem, of course, is, though, now that social media has become the new public square in the 21st century, if you are a normal person who's banned on Facebook and you want to share your opinion, where else are you going to go? Are you going to actually grab a soapbox and go downtown and start shouting it through a bullhorn? Maybe you'll get some traction if you're in New York, but if you're living in the middle of the country, going down to some small town main street doing that isn't going to get your case or your argument out there very much, your viewpoint out there. But
Right.
but if you're Alex Jones, you can just go to your own news channel. And so people are beginning, I think, to understand that we need to have some sort of intervention, whether that come from the government or whether that be in the form of trying to start more alternatives, although I'm not particularly a fan of that option, and I'll explain why in a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm mixed on it too, and I agree. You know, look, so social media has really, I think I was just discussing this with my mother today because we were discussing how I've been doing podcasting for 10 years now. I started in 2008. And, back when the whole social media thing started with Facebook and Twitter and, even smartphones, think back to 10 years ago and the whole smartphone thing. I don't think anyone really realized back then how revolutionary uh, this technology and these devices would be. Now, I think there are several positive aspects in terms of it's allowed us to communicate and connect with each other on multiple levels, and of course, we've discussed how there are drawbacks to that, obviously. But in terms of content distribution and whatnot, I mean, I was when I started podcasting, like I was a 14-year-old kid going into eighth grade, and then I grew over. Then I grew my podcast in high school, and now I'm a 23-year-old, college student. Think about that. I started building my audience when I was 14, and there are some other people who did that. Just average, ordinary, just average, ordinary, everyday people who, you know, have built up platforms for themselves, and that's the positive implication of social media. And I don't.
I think I think it's an interesting point you raise about social media allowing ordinary people to have a voice, and I think that's what really the core of this conflict is about. Because what was a huge determining factor in the 2016 election, in Donald Trump's entire career, almost, if you look at his history with Twitter, has been the usage of social media, and in particular the ability to use social media to craft a narrative counter to that of what the mainstream media is often putting out. And
Yeah,
so after Trump wins, of course, you suddenly see this huge push to regulate, not to regulate it, but the ironically enough, the journalist and political class begin demanding that social media CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey silence people who just so happen to oppose or have a different view on things than the media themselves do. What it essentially amounts to is the political class and the journalist class going and trying to silence the ordinary people, trying to put the cat back into the bag, as it were, and prevent people in the middle of the country who previously had no representation because they weren't in Hollywood and they weren't in the Wall Street and the New York Times crowd, trying to prevent them from having a voice, being able to show their side of the story.
yeah, and I would also add kind of a quick anecdote. As you know, I wasn't always a Trump supporter. Like in 2015, I was one of those people who thought, okay, Trump is kind of a dope candidate. He won't be around for very long. But I did ask like a couple people who I knew were like early on Trump supporters, in regards to the whole Twitter thing. I said, well, Trump's obnoxious and he shoots his mouth off, and like what's your appeal? And they all said, and I think today now they're right. Uh, Trump speaks. Trump is unfiltered on Twitter, and he uses Twitter as a mechanism to speak directly to the people. And the way he tweets, it's him. He's not tweeting through some PR office who's cleaning stuff up. He's actually communicating directly with the people, and I think that was a big part of his appeal. And I think as soon as the establishment, uh, figured that out, they were trying to figure out how to shut him down if they can. And now they're in the conundrum of, well, he's the president of the United States, so we can't shut him down because he's POTUS. And, Jack Dorsey has pretty much admitted that, much to his chagrin, that's the only reason why they haven't banned him. So
I think that would be a perfect opportunity for us to move on to Adam's second question.
Glad you mentioned that now. So the next question is, does the First Amendment right to free speech protect a company's right to censor content of their users? Why or why not? And explain your answer.
Well, I think it's unfortunate you had to step out for a minute there because we literally just discussed this a little bit. At least I did. So as I was saying earlier, Facebook bills itself, and and when I say Facebook, I'm referring to Twitter or social media in general, but Facebook's the big one, so I'm gonna just mainly refer to them. They bill themselves right now as if they were a big media or news company like the New York Times or whomever. And they use that as justification for saying, oh, well, we're able to censor whose views we put on here and who's not on here. But if so, they've radically changed the company, because that's what they did not market themselves as that at all up until recently. With your question specifically is, does the First Amendment protect the rights of companies to censor content? And I would say, yeah, I would say yes and no, and allow me to explain why my answer is kind of 50-50. Yes, as I said earlier, the New York Times, for example, or American Watchmen, even we do it, have the right to determine who or what viewpoints they are going to publish and promote, and what viewpoints they are not going to publish and promote. But that makes sense, though, because they are a media company, a news company that is influencing public opinion. Whereas Facebook, hit her toe, has been billed to the people anyway, as mainly a website, a platform you can go onto and you can share your opinions, or you can post pictures of your puppy dog, and you can basically just show your life off to other people in your social network. Only after Trump won the presidency, only after the political class sort of got a backhand from the American middle class, from the American people, did the journalists and other members of the political class start pressuring Facebook to control what kind of content they'll allow on there by pretending they're a media company. But the thing is, if Facebook's a media company, then they must be the most successful in the history of Earth in terms of keeping costs down, because damn near all of their journalists are not paid. Because who are the people that produce the content on Facebook? It's people like you and me. American Watchmen has a page on Facebook. Nobody pays us to promote our content. In fact, I think Facebook would sometimes rather not have our content on their platform at all. And so what I'm essentially saying, and I mentioned this earlier during your absence, is that Facebook has become essentially an online public square. If Alex Jones is banned from there, he can go to his TV station or his website, his own publication already, his own actual media company, and continue to air his views. But somebody in the middle of Nebraska, for example, would have no other recourse but to maybe start sending letters to the editor in their local paper, or going out with a bullhorn and a soapbox downtown. But who's going to actually hear them? How's that going to affect the national conversation? It probably isn't. Whereas online, they have the potential to reach millions of people. So for social media, because of the nature of the type of company it is, and more importantly, the nature of what these platforms have become, which is a online public square that was initially up until recently supposed to be for everybody, I would say no. Or better yet, and this is, I'm hoping we get into this more. Right now, yes, they are protected. I said no, but right now, as it stands as a private company, yeah, they do have that right. But I think the conversation needs to be had about how the public sector could be involved in this. Do we regulate it as a utility? Do we place it in a public trust? Do we do some trust busting and break up the company to allow there to be multiple competitors, so that there isn't a monopoly on who gets to say what online?
I pretty much, if I may just add in here, I pretty much agree with everything Josh just said. The only thing I would add is also with Facebook, and this is more prevalent with YouTube actually, but they are starting to try this with Facebook as well. There are platforms like YouTube where content creators can make money on their videos, or in the case of Anchor, monetizing podcasts, which is what I'm doing. So when YouTube, for example, censors a citizen journalist like my friend Dan Sandini, which they've done in the past, not only are they censoring Dan's free speech, but they're also taking away his stream of income or one of his streams of income to make, because he makes a living at citizen journalism, or he doesn't, but some of his associates do. So that's the other component to this. It's not just a free speech issue, but for some people, who are making a living based on content creation, this is really hurting them financially too. So that's another element we have to, ask ourselves. Is it ethical for these companies to provide the ability for users to make money and then all of a sudden take it away when it no longer suits the company? I don't think so. So, Adam, I'm curious, what do you think about all of this? I'll kind of redirect you on your own question.
Okay. It's kind of interesting because I know how I feel about it, but I don't like my answer, but I know it's the right answer. And for me, yes, the First Amendment does protect a company's right to censor content of its users and or employees. I may not like that answer, but if we start making laws against what companies can censor and what companies cannot, it's just the slippery slope is not always a fallacy, and it can just start down a road of further laws to further regulate free speech in the future.
I would kind of counter that. I think there is maybe, as I know we've sort of discussed on the show before, I've compared the times we were living into the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And during that time, industrialization was going on, and you had the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan and all the American titans of industry, I forget the actual historical term that was used for them, I forget what the term is. Robber barons, the robber barons, yes.
Yeah, the robber barons.
And so you had all of them and this new technology, which was radically changing the way people had lived at that time. We sort of see the same thing today, except instead of energy and electricity and how we power things, it's social media and how we communicate. Maybe even to an extent with automation now, depending on how quickly that goes, how we even make things. And with that in mind, I would point out that there were, back in those days, multiple different companies that were providing electricity, for example. But as time went on, we learned that it's not very fair in society to have multiple electric companies. It leads to all sorts of issues that affect public safety and the quality of life for people based on just where they're living or the amount of money they make. And so eventually our government Teddy Roosevelt decided to go in with some trust busting actions. In some cases, such as in the case of the Rockefellers, he decided that, look, your Standard Oil Company is too big. We're going to break it up and there's going to be a bunch of smaller ones. And maybe that's an answer we need to have with some of these social media companies. Other actions that were taken with particular respect to Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and their power industry was the decision to simply take all of them and create only one electric company, General Electric. Which seems to be where I sort of lean towards in this whole debate. But I think because of the nature of social media companies and the role they have begun to, whether they wanted to or not, whether they considered the implications or not back when they were first starting up, the fact that they've become a huge online public square that has supplanted the town halls we used to have where people used to congregate to discuss national questions. Because they have taken that over, we can't really afford to try and balkanize them and have multiple different ones where people are sort of locking themselves into echo chambers. And that's the historical precedent I would point to. So I understand the slippery slope. When I look at it like General Electric, the way we handled that situation and electrical power. I don't view it as being quite the same as a slippery slope to suddenly undoing the First Amendment.
Yeah. Like I said, or I said this while Adam was gone, but I'll just say again, these social media companies are very new. When you consider that the public internet has only been around, since the early '90s, and you consider the age of all these social media networks and their massive use, I mean, really, we've only been using Facebook and Twitter and whatnot for 10 or 11 years, which is not a lot of time. I think everyone, no matter what side of the debate you're on, can pretty much all agree that I don't think any of these companies really even knew how much of an influence they had they would have over the public square 10 years ago. We certainly didn't. And so I think now we're all asking, the question of, well, what is the role of these social media companies today? And, how much can the social media companies decide? How much do they get to decide? And how much onus should get put on them and how much onus should get put on lawmakers? So I think it's just a very complex issue.
It is. I mean, I I will offer a small rebuttal. It is the whole Hobby Lobby Supreme Court decision. It actually did set a precedence where the Supreme Court ruled that basically a corporation has the same rights as an individual citizen, which includes the right to freedom of speech, which in a sense can still protect them because if a social media network has the same rights as a human being under the constitutional right to free speech, then that would also give them the right to decide how they want to express themselves as a corporation. Now, if they decide they want to express themselves as a left-leaning corporation, that would give them the right to censor right-leaning content.
Okay. My other rebuttal, and uh I'm going to
If I could
butcher.
break in for one moment, and then I'll let Sam finish.
Sure.
If I randomly drop off the broadcast, it's because we're having a severe thunderstorm here right now, which literally didn't start until after we started the podcast. So in case I vanish, you know what's going on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the Facebook didn't terminate you. Yeah, we know. We get these here in Florida too. But anyway, as I was saying, my rebuttal would be something I found out recently that's actually fairly interesting, which was back during the 1920s, I think it was, when telephones started becoming a prevalent part of American life, and average Americans were getting telephones. There was, I believe, legislation passed to kind of bust up the monopoly that AT&T at the time, or whatever the name back in the 20s was, had over the telecommunications business, and that's kind of how the FCC got created. The big fear was that the telephone companies would be able to somehow influence elections, uh, based on people's ability to make phone calls to each other. And, that was 80 years. That's almost 100 years before social media. And yet people were worried about, the possible influence of a big, telecommunications company having too much interference over people just being able to make phone calls to each other. And, now in 2018, social media networks can do a hell of a lot more than just make phone calls. So, I'm not saying that maybe we have to do the exact same thing, but I think it is worth noting that if legislators were willing to pass some sort of regulation on the telephone companies 80 years ago, then certainly I don't think it's unfair to ask that we look at maybe, treating Facebook and all these other social media companies as maybe telecommunication companies now, if that makes sense.
I think it does. I mean, I think they already are I wouldn't say telecommunication, but they are a communications company more than anything. The problem I essentially take with, because right now the whole argument is, well, we have the right to censor you because we are a media company. But that has troubling implications, because if Facebook is a media company, then down the road, shouldn't you or I be able to sue them and say, hey, look, I make all of Facebook's content for them. How come I don't receive a paycheck? And I'm sure that's not a conversation they want to start having.
No.
Although, if they want to pay me to sit around and post my pictures of my dog, then I won't stop them. But I think they either if the government's not going to get involved, they either need to totally rebrand and totally be honest about it this time, and sort of not to mock Zuckerberg's youth, since we're all millennials here, but sort of man up and accept some responsibility for what exactly they are. And by that I mean they're basically going to have to come out and say, look, we are not what we said we were from 2000 and whenever they started. I'll say 2009 because that's when I joined. I know it's before that though.
2003.
From 2003, we said from 2003 to 2016 that we were simply a platform where anybody could come and share their opinions and views and be involved with their communities. Well, that's no longer the case, because now we only want people that are our type of preferred community. And so the rest of you can go and get stuffed. They either need to do that and stick with it, because they can't. It's a company can't. I mean, what would Walmart be if they flipped every other day what their company was supposed to be, right? And or whenever it was convenient for them. Or if they don't do that, they need to seriously consider allowing actual competition. Because right now they do everything within their power to either lobby the government or to buy out their opponents before they even have a chance to get up off the ground. And the few that do make it out there, like Gab or VK, but VK is almost entirely limited to the Eastern Europe and Russia. But their competitors like Gab end up becoming echo chambers full of extremists that no ordinary person wants to be on. So if they're not going to have the government involved, that's what needs to happen. But I don't think it's going to. I mean, based on the way the public conversation's already turning, where you have so many people on the left and the right saying the government needs to get involved in one way or the other, I think that's what's going to end up happening in the long run. I think something's going to happen. What exactly, I'm not sure, but we're at least starting to have the conversation, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, so something is going to happen regardless. We don't know what it is. The Wall Street Journal made a point in one of their in one of the columns I read a few weeks ago that Facebook and Twitter do have a problem, in the sense that if they do declare themselves, well, they have the problem of, if they are censoring, users, which they are, they're having a problem of, monitoring the activity of roughly, I'm just going to throw a number out here, 2 billion users. It's probably more than that. And, trying to regulate speech of all those people and decide whose content can be seen and who can't be. And I mean, even with all the algorithms, it's tough. And they're because they're not all in competition, they're only a couple hundred people are monitoring like a couple billion people. Just think about that for a sec.
Well, it's not just that, but look at the people they're monitoring. So, for example, Twitter was coming under criticism a lot for this. And I'm not going to. I've never seen one of these accounts, but I've read about. I've read in the media about them. But for example, ISIS terrorists have Twitter accounts, and they're open about the fact that it is a freaking a Twitter account for a terrorist, right? And those
Yeah.
ones are allowed to be on there. Nobody seems at Twitter headquarters seems to care, even though that's far worse than anything Alex Jones could post. Because regardless of how offensive Alex Jones is, it's not like he's sitting there using the platform to promote killing people or to try and organize or orchestrate killings and terror attacks like they are. But those accounts are up there and nothing happens to them. But Alex Jones gets suspended for 7 days or whatever on Twitter, or banned permanently off of Facebook. Why is that? Because if you are a political extremist of any stripe in a third world country, they do not give a crap because you are not a threat to their power base. So Facebook is in the Western governments, the globalist elite, the deep state, whatever you want to call them, are the ones that these big Silicon Valley tech giants are in bed with, right? And so
Yeah.
if you're threatening their narrative, then they will remove you from the platform. But if you're, some little extremist in some third world tin pot dictatorship and you're only challenging the local government or whatever, and terrorist accounts do more than that, obviously, which makes it even more troubling that they're on there. But for example, like a Maoist communist group in India, because they've had a problem with them for a long time, they won't ban those pages because they don't pose a threat to the Western globalist order. But they do pose a threat to India's political establishment. But Facebook doesn't care about that. So it's interesting how they only go after enemies of the so-called deep state or the so-called the globalist elite, be they the European Union or the political and journalistic class in America.
I remember. Let's bring it even closer to home. I remember 2 years ago. Do you guys remember when those cops were shot in Dallas, like 2 years ago, and a Black Lives Matter activist claimed it?
Vaguely.
Okay. Um, well, long story short, one of the sanctioned Black Lives Matter uh, people uh, basically made a painting of a militant black man basically slitting the throat of a white police officer, and like the caption was resist. Well, Facebook has a very clear policy saying that you cannot post imagery or videos clearly depicting violence, for creative purposes, unless it's like a newsworthy, unless it's like, a news footage or something like that. So, I reported this, and so did a lot of other people, as, abusive content going against Facebook's rules. And Facebook didn't do anything, and they sent out one of those things saying that they did a manual review, and they found that it did not go against their terms of service. But then I got banned for, I think, 24 hours for then posting on my own timeline about how I thought Facebook was being hypocritical for, going against their own terms of service. I got banned for that. So, you know, that's the other thing. Facebook is allowing certain groups to violate their terms of service. Meanwhile, they're punishing others who aren't even really violating their terms of service. They just may be saying controversial stuff, like Alex Jones.
I would just like to take this opportunity to brag that I have never been banned from any social network. On Facebook, actually, I think it's just because I've been on there for so long, but I'm not really sure. I've actually got added by them to some sort of power admins group, which really is just a big group where they stick admins of all these groups in there to share admin tips and network and stuff like that. And I haven't used it too much, although there are a few nifty tricks and tips I've learned in there.
Well, I
But
mean,
despite their bias, I've actually never myself had an issue. But I don't post near as much as I used to when I was younger either. So
well, neither do I. They haven't harassed me in like 2.5 years now because since the incident. Because what I do is I actually report all of the fake accounts, like all the porn and spam bots and whatnot. So I think they like keeping me around because I clean out the spam bots for them. So, but be careful, Josh. You just revealed that you're a conservative, or that you're not exactly a left and that you're anti-establishment. So, you know, I mean, I'm kind of joking, but not really. Your account could get deactivated for something here soon. So I hope not. But all right, Adam. Any other questions that you have?
No other questions. I think we've talked about almost everything with this.
I,
Um,
I'll say as we close that to our listeners, due to technical difficulties, we had some issues tonight, and we've tried our best to improvise for you. But that
you
was a
there?
poor speech on my part, I guess. I don't know. I didn't really have a conclusion thought out there. Um, I'll let Sam close us out.
Well, I mean, I just have one final question actually for Adam. Uh, so Adam, you're actually a tech guy, which is kind of why I wanted you to host this. So, what would be if you were the grand poobah of everything? What would be your solution to, I guess, fixing this whole debacle?
Fixing the whole debacle. We'll start something better. I mean, before Facebook, you had MySpace. MySpace is awesome, and then people, Mark Zuckerberg decided that MySpace wasn't as good, and so Facebook came out. Facebook will not be the last social media giant. It definitely wasn't the first. So I would say make the make the economical and technological climate as such where another social media giant can come out to compete with Facebook, which it will happen sooner than later. Facebook isn't they're not invincible. Facebook is not forever. So
Good point. Their stock is doing terrible. So who knows? Maybe we could have. I mean, you're an IT guy. I don't know how much you know of web development and whatnot, but who knows? We could have Hillscape or something like that. After your last name, or I don't know. So, but um, anyway, Josh, I suppose I'll ask you the same question. I mean, we kind of already talked a little bit, but are you still there?
Question for me for a minute, please.
I was just gonna say very briefly, what would you do if you could just if you were in charge of everything and you could dictate what was going to happen? How would you fix this problem?
Um, ironically, I don't see an issue with Google the way it is right now. Although I could see maybe the case for launching a trust bust case against them. I'm not saying I would. I've not seen them really have too many issues. Although perhaps if you want to look into, as Trump is doing, regulating to make sure that the search results are fair. But as far as I'm concerned, the search results have been pretty fair anyway. Um, but with Facebook specifically, though, I would be more open to probably doing one of two things. I lean more towards Steve Bannon's solution, which is taking Facebook and placing it into a public trust, which would enable users, anyway, to finally have recourse to their First Amendment rights or any other rights there. They could finally sue Facebook if they were having issues, because it would essentially be part of a public service at that point. Um, The other alternative, which Jeremy Corbyn has proposed, is creating a publicly owned version of Facebook, but I really don't quite get why or how that would work, given that Facebook itself I mean, think about it this way. It's essentially, if you already have a cow that's producing all the milk you need, then why waste your time trying to create an imitation cow to create milk? When you could just take the cow that's already there. So that's my take on that. To Adam's point about making your own, I guess I'm going to quote Michael Tracy verbatim on this, because he had a tweet on that where he said that essentially the equivalent of saying go make your own social media network would be like telling somebody in the late 18th century that if they didn't like John Rockefeller's and Standard Oil's operating policies, they should just go and create their own oil well. But obviously, not everybody can do that. And once a corporation gets big enough, it has the political clout, as Rockefeller certainly did. He had almost every member of Congress in his pocket for a while. Not just as Zuckerberg, I'm sure, and I know Google for sure has lobbied our government in the past. But they have the political and economic clout to prevent other people, even if they did have the means, from starting up realistic competitors. So I guess that would be my counterpoint on that.
Alrighty. Well, I think that concludes our panel tonight. I'll just say, kind of for my answer, mine is kind of going to be a cop out. I don't necessarily like the idea of a government run alternative to Facebook, or kind of like a public utility, just because I think it'll become like I just think it'll become like another slow and ineffective thing, just like the Obamacare website. I mean, they can't even do that, and yet they're going to try and run a social media company. I don't think so. I think I would have to agree with, Steve Bannon on this, that maybe, yeah, Facebook. I mean, in my ideal world, I would like to see some sort of thing where these social media companies can be run by their, owners and creators and boards of directors and what have you. But there needs to be some sort of like law or something regarding them being openly transparent about what they're doing, similar to the telecommunications thing back in the 20s. That's my best solution, but yeah, it's not perfect either. So we'll eventually see what happens with this. It's definitely going to this is definitely going to be a topic that will be debated, for years to come probably, and we'll see what happens in the future. So in the meantime, folks, I want to thank you for tuning in to the American Watchman Roundtable. You can visit our website at AmericanWatchman.org. Follow us on Twitter at @A_Watchman, and like our Facebook page. Gentlemen, anything that you want to promote?
Nope, none here.
They tell you when you're a child to not to do drugs and to stay in school. But when you get sick as a child, the doctor's literal advice is to do drugs and stay out of school. I guess that's my closing wisdom. I don't know. This has been a weird night for me.
That's kind of a good. You can make a stand-up comedy bit on that though, Josh. That was pretty good. So, as always, you can check out my website too, thesamwhitfield.com, and you can listen to my podcast, The Whitfield Report, which both Adam and Josh have been on. I think Josh has Adam beat on. Josh has been on my podcast 3 times now, I think, and Adam's been on once. Gabe hasn't been on at all yet, but I'm trying to get him onto my show. So, anyway, but we want to thank you for tuning in, and if you have any comments on our YouTube, please feel free to leave us your comments and let us know what you think. Other than that, have a great week, and God save the Queen.